On the mountain path, my daughter-in-law and my son suddenly pushed my husband and me off a cliff. Lying down there, bleeding, I heard my husband whisper, "Don't move, pretend to be dead." When they left, my husband revealed a truth more terrible than the fall. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The morning air in our cabin was a crisp, clean thing, smelling of pine needles and damp earth, a scent that always felt like the mountains were washing the city from my lungs. I took a deep, contented sip of my coffee, the steam warming my face, and looked out the vast picture window. Below us, the valley was still draped in a soft, ethereal blanket of fog, the peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains rising from it like islands in a silver sea. It was a view that made the soul feel quiet. It was perfect. "See that ridge over there, Lena?" Samuel, my husband of 35 years, spoke from the stove, his voice a low, warm rumble that was as familiar and comforting to me as my own heartbeat. He pointed with the spatula he was using to flip pancakes. "That's where we're headed today, the Pinnacle Trail. They say on a clear day you can see all the way to Tennessee. As long as it's not too steep for these old bones," I said with a smile, settling back into the plush armchair. He laughed, a deep, easy sound. "There's nothing old about you, woman." He brought over a plate piled high with fluffy golden brown pancakes, placing it on the rustic wooden table between us. At 61, Samuel was still a handsome man, his face a roadmap of a life well lived, his hands strong and calloused from the construction business he had built from the ground up. Washington Homes, our legacy, had started with a rusty pickup truck and a set of second-hand tools, and had become one of the most respected custom home builders in North Carolina. We had built a good life, a solid life, brick by brick. I watched him as he poured syrup over his stack, his movements efficient and sure. Our love was like that, I thought, a comfortable, well-built thing, its foundations solid, its rhythms predictable. We didn't need grand romantic gestures anymore. Our love was in the shared silence of a mountain morning, in the way he still knew exactly how I liked my coffee, in the easy unspoken understanding that had grown between us over 3.5 decades. The real cause for celebration this weekend, though, was our guests. Our son Michael and his wife Jasmine were due to arrive any minute. It had been months since we'd had any real time with them, their lives in Charlotte a whirlwind of social events and career ambitions that always seemed to leave little room for us. I missed my son. I missed the easy laughter and the long talks we used to have before his life became so complicated. Before Jasmine, I pushed the uncharitable thought away. Jasmine was beautiful, ambitious, and she made Michael happy. Or at least, she made him believe he was happy. She was an interior designer, though her real talent seemed to be in curating their flawless online image. To an outsider, they were the perfect couple, successful, attractive, the inheritors of a thriving family business. But I saw the shadows beneath the surface. I saw the strain in Michael's eyes, the way he sometimes looked at his wife with a mixture of adoration and something that looked unsettlingly like fear. "I'm so glad they could make it," I said, more to myself than to Samuel. "It's been too long. A good hard hike is just what Michael needs to clear his head." Samuel didn't reply immediately. He just stared out the window, his expression unreadable. A quiet, watchful tension had settled in his shoulders, something I had noticed growing in him over the past few months. Whenever Michael's name came up, I had attributed it to a father's worry. Michael had been making some questionable financial decisions lately, and Samuel, a man who valued prudence and hard work above all else, was finding it difficult to watch. A sleek, black SUV pulled up the gravel driveway, scattering the morning quiet. "They're here," I said, my heart giving a happy little flutter. I stood up, smoothing the front of my sweater, the simple maternal thrill of seeing my child overriding everything else. Michael got out of the driver's side. At 33, he was a handsome man, with his father's height and my softer features. But his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There were dark circles underneath them, a persistent, weary anxiety that a weekend in the mountains couldn't possibly erase. Jasmine emerged from the passenger side like a butterfly from a chrysalis. She was flawless even after a 2-hour drive, dressed in designer athletic wear that looked like it had never seen a speck of dust. She glided towards the cabin, her phone already in her hand, no doubt documenting their rustic arrival for her followers. "Mom, Dad," she called out, her voice a bright musical thing. She embraced me, her hug brief and fragrant with expensive perfume. Michael followed, his own hug feeling distracted, his arms barely closing around me before he pulled away. "The place looks great, Dad," Michael said, his eyes scanning the intricate woodwork of the cabin's porch. "Another masterpiece. It'll stand for 100 years," Samuel said, his voice holding a note of quiet pride. He clapped Michael on the shoulder, a classic stoic gesture of fatherly affection, but as he looked from our son to our daughter-in-law, his eyes were shadowed with that same unreadable expression I had seen earlier. It wasn't just worry, it was something deeper, something that looked in the clear, sharp light of the mountain morning, almost like dread. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a mother's overactive imagination. I wanted this weekend to be perfect, a happy memory to hold on to, and so I chose not to see the cracks that were already beginning to show in the foundation of our perfect family. The trail started as a gentle winding path through a forest of towering Fraser firs, the air cool and fragrant, the ground soft with a carpet of fallen needles. For the first hour the mood was light, almost cheerful. Jasmine, walking ahead with a brisk, athletic pace, kept her phone out, narrating their adventure for her online audience. "Hey everyone, out here in the gorgeous Blue Ridge Mountains with the fam. Getting our steps in before a huge dinner tonight. You guys, the air up here is just everything," she chirped into her phone, panning the camera around to capture the scenery, carefully editing us, the aging, unglamorous parents, out of the frame. I walked beside Samuel, our pace slower, more deliberate. I was content to just soak in the beauty of the woods, the quiet symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves. But I found my attention kept drifting to Michael. He was walking between us and Jasmine, a strange, silent figure in a familial no-man's land. He looked pale and drawn, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, his answers to my questions clipped and monosyllabic. "How's work been, honey?" I asked, trying to draw him out. "Fine," he said, his eyes not leaving the trail. "Busy. That big project in Biltmore Forest, is it finished?" Samuel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Michael flinched almost imperceptibly. "Almost," he muttered, "just some final details to work out." I knew from a conversation with Samuel a few weeks ago that the Biltmore Forest project was not almost finished. It was a disaster. It was over budget, behind schedule, and the clients were threatening to sue. Michael had been in charge. It was his first major solo project, his chance to prove himself, and he was failing. I also knew, from a source Samuel wouldn't reveal, that Michael's failure wasn't just due to inexperience. He had a gambling problem, a secret sickness that was siphoning money from the project accounts, a debt that was growing like a cancer in the heart of our family business. "It's just so old-fashioned, the way you guys do business," Jasmine called back, having apparently finished her social media update. She had paused at a bend in the trail, looking back at us with a bright, critical smile. "All this emphasis on craftsmanship and hand-hewn beams. The market is all about smart homes now, sustainable, prefabricated materials. We should be expanding, franchising. Your father is sitting on a gold mine, Michael, but he's too afraid to dig." The criticism was aimed at Samuel, but her eyes were on Michael, a subtle, sharp goad. It was a pattern I had seen before. She would praise his ambition while subtly belittling his father's wisdom, framing Samuel's caution as weakness, as a barrier to the grander, richer life she felt they deserved. "Jasmine has some great ideas, Dad," Michael said, his voice gaining a slight, defensive edge. "The business needs to evolve." "The business has been evolving just fine for 40 years, Samuel said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "It's built on a reputation for quality, not on chasing fads. A Washington home is meant to last. That's the brand. That's the legacy. A legacy no one under 50 cares about." Jasmine scoffed, turning to continue up the trail. The air grew thick with unspoken resentments. I tried to bridge the gap. "Well, I think it's wonderful that you two are so passionate about the future," I said, my voice sounding falsely bright even to my own ears. "Your father and I have always hoped you would take over one day." "Michael." He didn't answer. He just kicked at a loose stone on the path. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the things we were not saying. The gambling debts, the failing project, the bitter, simmering impatience of two children who wanted to inherit a kingdom without understanding the sacrifice it took to build it. As the trail grew steeper, the physical exertion seemed to amplify the emotional strain. Michael was breathing heavily, a sheen of sweat on his pale forehead. Jasmine, incredibly, seemed untouched by the climb, her energy boundless. Samuel had grown even quieter, his watchfulness intensifying. He kept a steady pace just behind me, his presence a solid, reassuring weight at my back. But every time we navigated a particularly tricky section of the trail, a steep scramble over rocks or a narrow ledge, I would feel his hand hover near the small of my back, ready to steady me. I had always taken it as a gesture of care, of his lifelong instinct to protect me. But today, it felt different. It felt vigilant, as if he wasn't just protecting me from the mountain but from something or someone else on the trail with us. I looked at the strained, anxious face of my son, and the bright, predatory smile of my daughter-in-law, and for the first time, a cold, sharp sliver of unease pierced the warm cocoon of my motherly love. After another hour of grueling near-vertical climbing, the dense canopy of trees abruptly fell away, and we stepped out onto the summit. The view was staggering, a panoramic 360-degree vista of the Blue Ridge Mountains rolling away to the horizon in endless overlapping waves of hazy blue and deep green. We were standing on a narrow, rocky outcrop, a granite spine that jutted out into the vast emptiness. The wind was stronger up here, a wild, clean thing that whipped at our hair and clothes. On three sides the ground simply vanished, dropping away into a dizzying 1,000-foot fall. "Oh, my God," I breathed, taking a cautious step closer to the edge, my hand instinctively reaching for Samuel's. "It's incredible." "Told you it was worth the climb," Samuel said, his hand closing around mine, his grip firm and reassuring. He stood beside me, a solid, unmovable presence against the vast, dizzying emptiness. Even Michael seemed momentarily humbled by the sheer scale of the landscape. He stood a few feet away, his chest heaving, his gaze lost in the distant hazy peaks. For a moment the anxious, resentful man was gone, replaced by the boy I remembered, the one who had always been awed by the power of nature. Jasmine, however, saw the view not as a landscape, but as a backdrop. Her eyes lit up with a different kind of appreciation. "This is insane," she said, her voice reverent. "The lighting is perfect. The background is epic. Michael, get your phone out. We need to get this. This is content gold." The spell of the moment was broken. She immediately went into director mode, scouting the small, rocky platform for the best angles. "Okay, the composition is better over there, right at the edge," she declared, pointing to a spot where the rock was crumbly and the drop was most severe. "The way the cliff falls away will look amazing. It'll be so dramatic." "Jasmine." "I don't know," I said, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. "It looks a little unstable right there." She gave me a dazzling, dismissive smile. "Oh, don't worry, Lena. It's fine, we'll be careful. It's for the gram, you have to be willing to suffer for the art," she said with a laugh, as if the idea of real danger was a quaint, amusing concept. She began to arrange us, her hands fluttering as she positioned us like props in her personal photo shoot. "Okay, Michael, you stand here. Mom, Dad," she said, using the familial terms with a casual ease that suddenly sounded jarring and false. "You two stand right here in the middle." "Perfect. A little closer together, and turn just a little bit towards me." "Yes, just like that, with the valley behind you." She positioned us with our backs to the cliff's edge, just a few feet from the precipice. I could feel the unnerving emptiness behind me, the pull of the void. A primal, instinctual alarm bell began to ring in the back of my mind. "Jasmine, honey, this is really too close," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's just for a second, Mom," Michael said, his voice strained. He wouldn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on Jasmine, his expression a strange, tense mixture of anxiety and a desperate, pleading eagerness to please her. Samuel put a protective arm around my waist. His body was rigid, coiled like a spring. "We'll take one picture, Jasmine," he said, his voice a low, hard command. "And then we're moving back." Okay, everybody smile," she chirped, oblivious to the tension, or perhaps reveling in it. She held Michael's phone up, her own face a perfect, practiced smile as she framed the shot. I looked at my family, arranged on the edge of the world, my husband tense and watchful beside me, my son, his face a pale, sweaty mask of inner conflict, and my daughter-in-law, her bright, predatory smile reflected in the dark screen of the phone. The wind whipped a strand of hair across my face, and the beautiful, magnificent view suddenly felt menacing. The vast emptiness behind me, not a thing of beauty but a hungry, waiting mouth. I forced a smile for the camera, a brittle, paper-thin thing, trying to ignore the screaming voice in my head that was telling me something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. The world tilted on its axis. One moment I was standing on the edge of the cliff, a forced smile plastered on my face, the wind a wild song in my ears. The next, A violent, shocking force slammed into my back. It wasn't a stumble or a trip. It was a push. Deliberate, brutal, unmistakable. The moment was a chaotic, sensory explosion that seemed to stretch and distort time. I registered everything in a series of stark, disjointed flashes, like snapshots from a nightmare. The hands. 2 sets of them. I felt them strong and decisive. One on the small of my back, one on Samuel's. The force was synchronized. A coordinated, violent shove. Jasmine's face. Her practiced smile for the camera had vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, triumphant determination. Her eyes, which had been so bright and full of life, were now flat and hard as stones. There was no hesitation in them, no flicker of doubt, only the chilling, absolute certainty of a predator closing in on its prey. Michael's face. This was the image that would sear itself into my memory forever. His expression was a grotesque collage of terror, guilt, and a desperate, pathetic resolve. His eyes were wide, his lips pulled back in a grimace that was almost a sob. He was looking at me, his own mother, as he pushed me towards my death. And in his eyes I saw not just the betrayal but the terrible, agonizing weight of it. He was a weak man committing a monstrous act, and the horror of it was written all over his face. The ground vanished. The solid, dependable rock I had been standing on was simply gone, replaced by an endless, heart-stopping expanse of empty air. My feet scrambled for purchase on nothing. The sky rushed up to meet me, or rather the world flipped upside down, the hazy blue of the horizon cartwheeling with the deep green of the valley below. My body was weightless, a rag doll thrown from a great height, tumbling through the void. A scream was torn from my throat. A raw, primal sound of pure, unadulterated terror. It was a sound I didn't recognize as my own. Beside me I heard Samuel's own guttural cry, a roar of rage and disbelief. The fall was a terrifying, silent eternity. The wind screamed past my ears, whipping the tears from my eyes, stealing the breath from my lungs. The world was a blur of spinning rock and sky. I saw my life not in a flash of happy memories but in a single agonizing question. Why? The image of Michael's face, his eyes full of a terrible, weak-willed anguish, was burned into my mind. My son, my child, the little boy whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose nightmares I had soothed, whose life I had cherished above my own. That little boy had just tried to kill me. The impact was a brutal, shattering explosion of pain. It wasn't a single moment, but a series of them as my body careened off a jagged outcrop of rock before finally coming to a stop on a narrow, sloping ledge. Far below the summit, the world went white, then red, then black. Pain was a supernova erupting in my leg, my ribs, my head. Every nerve in my body was screaming at once. And then, just as the darkness threatened to swallow me whole, I heard voices, faint, distorted, floating down from the world above. The world of the living. Is it done? It was Michael's voice, high-pitched and shaking, laced with a hysterical, panicked edge. Are they? And then Jasmine's reply. Her voice, a thing of pure, chilling practicality, utterly devoid of emotion. No one could survive that fall. It's done. Come on. We have to get back to the car. We have to call it in. Stick to the story, Michael. Remember what we rehearsed. It was a tragic accident. They slipped. Their voices faded, followed by the sound of their footsteps scrambling away from the scene of their crime, leaving us for dead. I lay there bleeding, broken, on a cold slab of rock. The world a dizzying, pain-filled haze. The betrayal was a wound deeper and more agonizing than any physical injury. My son, my Jasmine, they had left us here to die. The darkness began to close in again, a welcome, painless oblivion. But just as I was about to surrender to it, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Samuel. He was lying beside me, his face a bloody mask, his breathing a ragged, shallow rasp. His eyes were open, and they were fixed on me with a desperate, urgent intensity. Through a bloody, broken lip, he whispered 2 words, his voice a faint, urgent breath that was almost lost in the wind. Don't move. Pretend to be dead. The words were a lifeline in a sea of pain and confusion. Samuel's voice, though barely a whisper, was imbued with a lifetime of authority and a desperate, primal urgency. Pretend to be dead. The command cut through the fog of my agony, a clear, sharp signal in the overwhelming static of my senses. My body screamed in protest. Every instinct was to cry out, to move, to curl into a ball and surrender to the pain. My left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, a hot, searing fire radiating from my hip, My ribs felt like a cage of shattered glass. Each shallow breath a fresh wave of agony. A warm, sticky wetness was spreading at my temple. But I obeyed. I forced my body into a stillness that was a lie. A performance for an audience I could no longer see but could still feel, their malevolent presence lingering on the cliff edge far above. I let my eyes fall half closed, my breathing become shallow and uneven. I focused on the rough texture of the rock beneath my cheek, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. I became a broken thing, a lifeless form, indistinguishable from the other rocks and debris on the ledge. Beside me Samuel did the same. His ragged breathing ceased, and he became utterly still. We were two broken statues, a grim tableau of a tragic accident. Time lost all meaning. It stretched and compressed, measured only by the throbbing of my own pulse in my ears, and the slow agonizing drip of blood from the cut on my head. I listened. I listened with an intensity I had never known, my hearing sharpened by terror and adrenaline. I listened for the sound of their footsteps returning, for the dislodged pebble that would signal their descent to confirm their crime. I heard only the wind, a lonely, mournful sound as it swept across the face of the mountain, and then, faintly, so faintly, I thought I might be imagining it. I heard their voices again, drifting down from the trail far above us now. They were arguing. "Can't believe you were so calm." Michael's voice, thin and reedy with panic. "What if someone saw us?" "No one saw us." Jasmine's voice, sharp and impatient. "This place is deserted. That's why I picked it. Now stop whining and get yourself together. You need to be able to cry on command when we call the police. You're the grieving son, remember? You need to sell it." She picked it. The words were a fresh stab of betrayal. This wasn't a spontaneous opportunistic act. It was premeditated, planned. She had chosen this beautiful isolated place not for its view but for its lethality. Their voices faded again, swallowed by the vast indifferent wilderness. We waited. The sun began to creep across the sky, its warmth a cruel mockery of the icy cold that had settled deep in my bones. Every muscle in my body screamed to move, to shift, to find some relief from the agonizing pressure on my broken bones. But Samuel's command echoed in my mind. Pretend to be dead. An hour, maybe more, passed in this state of suspended, agonizing stillness. It was a lifetime. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain a relentless pulsing tide. In my lucid moments my mind replayed the push, the fall, the faces of my son and his wife. The images were a form of torture, more profound than any physical pain. How does a mother reconcile the memory of her son's first steps with the memory of his hands pushing her to her death? The two realities could not coexist in the same universe, yet they did. The world had been remade. The fundamental laws of love and family had been repealed. I was no longer a wife, a mother, a retired teacher. I was a survivor of an attack, and the assailants were my own flesh and blood. Or so I thought. Finally, when the sun had moved far enough across the sky to cast our ledge in deep shadow, Samuel moved. A low guttural groan of pure agony was ripped from his throat. The sound was so full of pain it made my own injuries feel distant. "They're gone," he rasped, his voice thick with pain and something else I couldn't identify. "They're really gone." The relief that should have come with those words did not arrive. There was no relief, only the cold, hard reality of our situation. We were alive, yes. But we were broken, bleeding and trapped 1,000 feet down the side of a mountain, left for dead by our own children. The performance was over. The long, desperate struggle for survival had just begun. The long, agonizing hour of stillness was a crucible. Every second was a battle between the screaming demands of my body and the cold, hard necessity of survival. I focused on the tiny details of my immediate surroundings, the pattern of lichen on the rock near my face, the faint, earthy smell of the stone, the feeling of the mountain's cold seeping into my bones. These were the only things that were real. The rest, my life, my family, my identity had been vaporized in the fall. Lying there, I became acutely aware of Samuel's presence beside me. His stillness was even more profound than my own, a testament to a lifetime of disciplined self-control. But I could feel his pain, a radiating heat of agony that seemed to travel through the rock between us. We were two separate islands of suffering, united by a shared, unspoken command. The mental discipline required to lie motionless while my body was on fire was immense. My mind, a frantic, wounded animal, kept trying to bolt. It replayed the betrayal on a relentless loop. Michael's face, a mask of pathetic, sweaty resolve. Jasmine's, a study in cold, reptilian ambition. I saw their hands, pushing. I felt the sickening weightless lurch as the world fell away. To stop the flood of images, I started to retreat into my professional self. I became a teacher again, a woman of logic and order. I began to analyze the situation, to break it down into manageable parts. Problem: attempted murder by son and daughter-in-law. Objective: survival. Variables: 2 critically injured adults. Isolated location, no immediate hope of rescue. First step: assess the situation. This internal monologue, this retreat into the familiar patterns of my old life, was a shield against the overwhelming emotional trauma. It was a way to keep from shattering completely. I listened to the wind. It was a constant mournful presence, sighing through the pines on the cliffs far above. It carried no more voices, no more sounds of scrambling feet. The silence from above was now absolute. They were gone. They were down the mountain, back in the world of the living, preparing their lies, rehearsing their grief. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold fury through me, a welcome heat that momentarily eclipsed the pain. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long menacing shadows across the rock face, the cold began to set in. It was a deep penetrating cold that ached in my broken bones. Hypothermia, my logical mind supplied. Another variable, another enemy. I started to shiver, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that racked my already battered body. Each spasm sent a fresh explosion of pain through my ribs. I bit my lip to keep from crying out, the coppery taste of blood a sharp, grounding sensation. I had to wait for Samuel's signal. He was the one who had made the call. He was the one who was leading this grim, silent battle. I think I passed out for a while. The world dissolved into a gray, painless fog. When I came to, the light had changed. The harsh afternoon sun had softened into the golden, melancholy light of late evening. The shadows were long and deep, and Samuel was moving. His first movement was a small, agonizing turn of his head. A groan, low and thick with pain, was torn from his throat. He pushed himself up onto his one good elbow, his face a contorted mask of effort. His other arm hung at a sickeningly wrong angle. "Lena," he rasped, his voice a dry, cracking thing. "Lena, can you hear me?" I tried to answer, but my throat was too dry, my lips too swollen. I managed a small, croaking sound. He saw my eyes flutter open. A flicker of profound relief passed over his bloody face. "They're gone," he said again, this time with a certainty that finally allowed the tension to begin to drain from my body, leaving behind only the vast, empty ocean of pain. "They're really gone." I finally allowed myself to move. I tried to push myself up, but a blinding white-hot agony shot from my hip up to my skull, and I collapsed back onto the rock, a scream tearing from my raw throat. Samuel was beside me in an instant, his own injuries forgotten. He crawled to my side, his movements slow and torturous. "Don't move," he said, his voice urgent. "Your leg. I think it's broken badly." I lay there weeping, the tears carving clean paths through the grime and dried blood on my face. The pain was immense, but it was the betrayal that was truly breaking me. "Why?" I sobbed, the question a ragged, desperate plea to a universe that no longer made sense. "Why would he do this to us, Samuel? Why would my son, my Michael?" I looked at my husband, seeking some comfort, some explanation, some shared anchor in our shared nightmare. But the look on his face was not one of shared confusion. It was something else. It was a look of profound, soul-deep guilt, a sorrow so immense it seemed to eclipse his own physical pain. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the broken, bleeding mess of my leg, and his own body began to shake with a quiet, terrible sob. And in that moment, I knew that the nightmare was not over. The fall from the cliff had just been the beginning. The world had been reduced to this small, merciless ledge of rock. The vast, beautiful panorama of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which had seemed so majestic just hours before, now felt like a prison wall, a silent, indifferent witness to our suffering. The immediate threat of Michael and Jasmine was gone, but they had been replaced by a host of new, more impersonal enemies. Shock, blood loss, infection, and the slow, creeping cold of the coming night. Samuel, his face a grim mask of pain and determination, took charge. The quiet, thoughtful man I had known for 35 years was gone, replaced by a primal survivor. The skills he had learned over a lifetime of building things, of understanding structures and stresses, were now being repurposed for the grim task of keeping us alive. "Lena, I need you to stay with me," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. He crawled around me, his movements slow and agonizing, assessing the damage to my body with a practiced, almost clinical detachment. Talk to me. Tell me where it hurts the most. Everywhere, I sobbed, the word a pathetic, useless summary of the overwhelming agony. My leg. My side. He gently, carefully ran his hands over my ribs. I screamed as his fingers found the source of the sharpest pain, a clear, sickening give in the bone. A few broken ribs for sure, he muttered, his breath hissing between his teeth. We can't do anything about that right now. We need to focus on the leg, and stopping the bleeding. His own injuries were severe. His left arm was clearly broken, the bone unnaturally angled beneath the torn fabric of his shirt. A deep, ugly gash on his forehead was still oozing blood, matting his graying hair into dark, sticky clumps, but he seemed oblivious to his own pain. His entire being focused on me. He tore a long strip of fabric from the bottom of his own shirt, his one good hand, and his teeth working together in a grim, efficient partnership. He began to clean the gash on my head. His touch surprisingly gentle. It's not as deep as it looks, he said, his voice a strained attempt at reassurance. But we need to keep pressure on it. He then turned his attention to my leg. The sight of it made my stomach churn. My hiking pants were torn at the hip, and the bone was clearly dislocated. My leg twisted at an impossible, sickening angle. The pain was a living, breathing monster, a roaring fire that consumed all thought. Okay, Lena, he said, his voice taking on a new, hard edge. This is going to be the worst part. I have to try and set it. If I don't, you could lose the leg, or bleed out internally. Do you understand? I nodded, my teeth chattering with a mixture of cold and terror. I need you to scream, he said, his eyes finally meeting mine. They were filled with a terrible, agonizing apology. Scream as loud as you can. It'll help. On 3. 1. 2. He didn't wait for 3. He grabbed my leg with his one good hand and pulled a sudden, brutal, wrenching motion that sent a bolt of pure white-hot agony through my body. The world exploded into a supernova of pain. I screamed. A raw, ragged, inhuman sound that was torn from the very depths of my soul. A sound that echoed off the indifferent rock face and was swallowed by the vast, empty sky. And then, mercifully, the world went black. When I came to, the pain was no longer a sharp, tearing thing, but a deep, throbbing, all-consuming fire. Samuel was slumped beside me, his face pale and slick with sweat, his body trembling with the aftershock of the effort. He had managed to straighten my leg, and he was in the process of fashioning a crude splint from a broken tree branch and more strips of his shirt. It's done, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. It's not perfect, but it's straight. It'll hold. He finished tying the last knot and then collapsed beside me, his own energy finally spent. We lay there for a long time, two broken bodies on a cold slab of rock, the silence broken only by our own ragged, painful breathing. The sun had dipped below the western ridge, and the world was bathed in a cold purple twilight. The temperature was dropping fast. The physical wreckage was clear. A broken leg, broken ribs, a broken arm, concussions, countless cuts and bruises. We were a catalogue of injuries. But as the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by the grim reality of our situation, I knew that our physical wounds were the least of our problems. The true wreckage was emotional. It was the shattered trust, the murdered love, the gaping, unfixable wound of our son's betrayal. And as I lay there shivering, I began to realize that Samuel's wreckage was different from mine. His was not just of grief, but of a terrible, crushing guilt that seemed to radiate from him in palpable waves. As the last light of day bled from the sky, the cold began its assault. It was a merciless, invasive thing seeping through my torn clothes and into my bones, making my teeth chatter in a violent, uncontrollable rhythm. The physical pain was a constant, roaring fire, but it was the cold that felt like death. A slow, creeping advance that threatened to shut down my body, one system at a time. We huddled together for warmth, our broken bodies pressed against each other, the shared misery a strange, grim form of intimacy. The silence between us was no longer just the silence of shock. It was thick with the things we were not saying, the questions I was too afraid to ask, the answers I was terrified he might give. Finally, I couldn't bear it anymore. The question that had been clawing at the inside of my skull since I'd woken up on this cursed ledge finally tore its way out. My voice a raw, broken whisper in the encroaching dark. Why Samuel? I wept, the tears freezing on my cheeks. Why would he do this to us? To me? I was his mother. I loved him. I loved him more than my own life. What did we do? What did I do wrong to make my own son hate me so much that he would? I couldn't finish the sentence. The words were too monstrous to speak aloud. I looked at my husband, desperate for an answer, for some piece of logic that could make sense of the unthinkable. I expected him to share my confusion, to rage against the inexplicable cruelty of our child. But he didn't. Instead, Samuel's face, illuminated by the cold pale light of the rising moon, seemed to crumple in on itself. A sound escaped his throat, a low guttural noise of a pain so profound it seemed to come from the very center of the earth. It was not the sound of a man in physical agony, it was the sound of a soul breaking. He rolled his head away from me, unable to meet my eyes, and stared out into the vast, dark emptiness of the valley. "It's not your fault, Lena," he rasped, his voice thick with a grief that was deeper and older than the events of this terrible day. "It was never your fault, it was mine. All of it, from the beginning." "What are you talking about?" I asked, a new cold fear beginning to snake its way around my heart, a fear that had nothing to do with the cold or our injuries. "What beginning?" He took a deep, shuddering breath, a sound that was half sob, half groan, and then he began to speak. And with his words, the world I knew, the life I had lived, the very foundation of my identity, was systematically, brutally, and irrevocably demolished. "Michael," he began, his voice cracking. "Lena, Michael, he isn't your son." The words didn't register at first. They were nonsense, the delirious rambling of a man with a head injury. "What?" I whispered. "Samuel, you're not making any sense. You're hurt." "No," he said, and he finally turned to look at me, his eyes shining with a terrible, agonizing clarity in the moonlight. His face was a mask of shame and a grief so profound it looked like it had been carved there. "I'm making sense for the first time in 33 years. He's not yours, Lena, he's mine." He told me the story, the truth he had carried like a cancer in his soul for more than 3 decades. It had happened 34 years ago. We had been trying for a baby for years with no success. The doctors had told us it was unlikely, that my body was not cooperating. I had been devastated. And he, in his own quiet way, had been just as heartbroken. That year he had gone to a construction conference in Denver. He was lonely, he was drinking too much, and he had made a mistake, a terrible one-night mistake with a woman he barely knew, a waitress at the hotel bar. He had come home sick with guilt, and had sworn to himself he would never tell me that he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me, and he had. But 9 months later the woman had found him. She had called him at his office, telling him she'd had a baby, a boy, his boy, and she was dying. A complication from the birth. She had no family, there was no one. "I didn't know what to do," Samuel whispered, his voice cracking with the memory of that long-ago panic. "If I told you the truth, I knew I would lose you, and I couldn't live with that. Losing you was a fate worse than death, so I lied." The lie he had constructed was a masterpiece of desperation and deceit. He told me he had found a private surrogate, a young woman who wanted to remain anonymous. He said he had handled all the arrangements, paid all the fees to spare me any more pain or disappointment. It was a time before the internet, before everything was so easily checked. I had been so desperate for a child, so full of love for him for making this miracle happen that I had never questioned it. He had flown to Denver, signed the papers, and brought the baby home. Our baby, Michael. I lay there on the cold rock, the physical pain in my body a distant, irrelevant echo. All I could feel was the shattering of my entire world. The love I had poured into Michael, the fierce, all-consuming biological bond I had felt for him. It was all based on a lie. The 35 years of my marriage, the comfortable, solid thing I had cherished. It was a house built on a foundation of deceit. The fall from the cliff had been a terrifying, brutal betrayal. But this was worse. This was an annihilation of the soul. The truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. It settled over our cold, broken bodies on that ledge. A shroud far colder and heavier than the mountain night. Samuel's confession recontextualized every memory, every joy, every sorrow of the past 33 years, twisting them into grotesque parodies of what I thought they had been. My son was not my son. My husband was not the man I knew. My life was not my life. I stared up at the vast, indifferent spray of stars, and I felt a detachment so profound it was almost an out-of-body experience. The woman lying on this rock, Lena Washington, was a stranger to me. She was a character in a long, elaborate play, and she had just discovered that the entire script was a work of fiction. The first betrayal, the push from the cliff, had been an act of brutal physical violence. It was a shock to the system, a violation of the natural order. But this second betrayal, the one delivered in a broken whisper in the dark, was an act of metaphysical violence. It didn't just break my bones, it broke my reality. I thought of the day Samuel brought Michael home. I remembered the overwhelming tidal wave of love I had felt the moment he placed that tiny swaddled bundle in my arms. I had looked into that baby's face and I had seen a miracle. My miracle. I had bonded with him instantly, the fierce primal instinct of a mother kicking in with a force that had left me breathless. I had felt it in my very cells. I had believed it was the call of my own blood. Now I knew it was all a lie. My body had not recognized its own. It had been fooled. I had been fooled. The love was real, of course. The love had been the most real thing in my life. But the foundation upon which it was built, the biological imperative, the sacred bond of mother and child, was a fraud. And Michael, the boy I had raised, the boy whose fevers I had cooled, whose tears I had dried, whose every triumph had felt like my own. Had he ever sensed it? Did some part of him on a deep instinctual level know that he did not belong to me? Was that the root of his resentment, his weakness, his inability to ever truly connect? Had he spent his life feeling like an imposter in his own family, because that is exactly what he was? The cruelty of it was staggering. Samuel, in his desperate, selfish attempt to save our marriage, had damned us all. He had trapped his own son in a lie, a child forced to grow up under the loving gaze of a woman who was a stranger. He had sentenced me to a life of phantom motherhood, loving a child who was a living, breathing symbol of his own infidelity. "Lena," Samuel whispered, his voice thick with a desperate, pleading agony. "Please, say something, scream at me, hit me, anything. Just don't be silent." But I couldn't speak. Words were inadequate. What could I possibly say that could encompass the sheer annihilating magnitude of this revelation? The pain in my leg was a dull, distant throb compared to the gaping black hole that had opened up in the center of my being. The man lying beside me, the man whose warmth I had sought just moments before, was a stranger. He was a man who had looked me in the eye every day for 33 years, and had told me the most profound lie a person can tell. He had let me love a child that was the product of his betrayal. He had watched me pour my entire soul into a fantasy he had constructed out of his own fear and guilt. The rage, when it finally came, was a cold, quiet thing. It was not the hot, explosive fury of a woman scorned. It was the icy, deliberate rage of a woman whose entire existence had been invalidated. I finally turned my head and looked at him. My gaze was flat, my eyes devoid of the love and warmth he had known for 35 years. "You should have let me die in the fall," I said, my voice a dead, hollow thing. "It would have been a kindness." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He flinched, his face contorting in a mask of pure, undiluted agony. This was his judgment. This was the consequence of his long-ago sin, finally delivered on a cold, dark mountain, witnessed only by the silent, unblinking stars. We were two souls in hell, a hell we had built together, one of us with his lies, the other with her blind, trusting love. Dawn arrived not with a gentle, hopeful glow, but as a slow, merciless unveiling of our grim reality. The rising sun illuminated the full horror of our situation, the precariousness of our ledge, the sheer terrifying drop below, and the battered, broken state of our own bodies. The night had been a long, cold, agonizing ordeal, a descent into a private hell of pain and revelation. The day promised a new kind of hell, the impossible struggle for survival. The cold rage I felt towards Samuel had not dissipated, but it had been packed away, compartmentalized. The teacher in me, the pragmatist, knew that my anger was a luxury we could not afford. Survival was the only thing that mattered now. Recriminations could wait, if we lived long enough for them. It was Samuel who, despite his own agony and the crushing weight of his guilt, took charge. The builder, the man who understood physics and leverage and stress points, assessed our situation with a grim professional eye. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice a raw rasp. "We'll die of exposure or dehydration. The only way is down. The tree line is about 500 feet below us. If we can make it there, we might find a game trail, maybe even a creek." "Down?" I asked, the word a croak. I looked at my splinted, useless leg. "How, Samuel? I can't walk. You have one arm." "We're not going to walk," he said, his eyes scanning the rock face around us. "We're going to crawl, and slide, and pray." The journey that followed was a Dantean descent, a grueling, torturous ordeal that blurred into a single continuous nightmare of pain and effort. Samuel moved with a single-minded, almost terrifying determination. He would find a path, a series of small ledges and stable rocks. And then he would guide me, pushing, pulling, and sometimes half carrying my dead weight. His one good arm and his legs straining with an effort that left him trembling and gasping for breath. Every movement was an agony. Every scrape against the rough granite tore at our already shredded clothes and skin. My broken leg was a constant searing torment. With every jolt, every awkward slide, a fresh wave of nausea and pain would wash over me, and I would have to bite down on the strip of leather Samuel had torn from his belt to keep from screaming. We didn't speak of the betrayal. We barely spoke at all. Our communication was reduced to the primal language of survival, grunts of effort, sharp intakes of breath, whispered words of instruction. Hand here, Lena, brace yourself, don't look down. But the silence was filled with the unspoken truths that now lay between us. As he strained to move a loose boulder from our path, his face a mask of pain, I saw not just my husband, but a stranger burdened by a lifetime of deceit. As I looked at his broken arm, his bloody face, I felt not just a wife's concern, but the cold, detached pity one might feel for a fallen enemy. We were no longer a husband and wife. We were two co-conspirators in the grim business of staying alive. Our shared goal, a fragile temporary truce in a much larger, more personal war. Hours bled into one another, the sun beat down on us, merciless and hot, cracking our lips and baking the dried blood on our skin. We ran out of the little water we had in Samuel's flask. Thirst became a new tormentor, a dry, rasping fire in our throats. At one point my splinted leg snagged on a thorny bush and the jolt of pain was so intense that I blacked out. I came to with Samuel gently slapping my face, his own eyes glazed with exhaustion and fear. Stay with me, Lena, he pleaded, his voice cracking. Don't you quit on me, not now. I looked at him, at this man whose lie had defined my entire adult life, and I saw the raw, desperate terror in his eyes. He was not just afraid of dying on this mountain. He was terrified of me dying on this mountain. Terrified of me dying before he had a chance to atone, before he could even begin to beg for a forgiveness he knew he would never receive. And in that moment, I understood, my survival had become his last, desperate hope for a redemption that would likely never come. And so, fueled by a cold, bitter spite, I chose to live. I'm not quitting, I rasped, my voice a dry, dusty thing. You don't get off that easy. A flicker of something, relief, pain, he was too exhausted for me to tell, passed over his face. He nodded, and then with a groan that seemed to tear from the depths of his soul he began to move again, dragging us, inch by agonizing inch, further down the mountain and deeper into our own private hell. While we were fighting for our lives on the cold, unforgiving face of the mountain, Michael was in Asheville performing the role of his life. He was the grieving son, and he was giving a masterful performance. He and Jasmine had made it back to the trailhead late in the afternoon, their faces artfully smeared with dirt, their clothes appropriately disheveled. It was Jasmine who made the 911 call, her voice a perfect, hysterical symphony of panic and grief. My parents-in-law, she had shrieked into the phone. We were hiking at the pinnacle. They slipped. Oh my God, they went right over the edge. Please, you have to send help. By the time the park rangers and the sheriff's deputies arrived, Michael had collapsed onto the hood of his SUV, his face buried in his hands, his body racked with shuddering theatrical sobs. He played the part of the son in shock, unable to speak, able to communicate only in choked, broken fragments. It was so fast, he mumbled to the sympathetic lead ranger. One minute we were taking a picture, the next they were just gone. The rocks were loose. They just disappeared. Jasmine, ever the pragmatist, handled the details. She gave the official statement, her own eyes shining with convincing crocodile tears. She described the accident with a screenwriter's eye for detail, painting a vivid, tragic picture of a beautiful family outing gone horribly wrong. She was brilliant. She was a monster. The news, of course, was devastating to our small, tight-knit community in Asheville. Friends and business associates began to descend on the luxury hotel suite that Michael and Jasmine had checked into, a command center for their fraudulent grief. The suite quickly filled with flowers, condolence cards, and concerned friends offering casseroles and comfort. Michael moved through the sympathetic crowds like a ghost, his face a perfect mask of sorrow. He accepted hugs, he nodded mutely at words of comfort, he played the part of the broken child to perfection, and people believed him. Of course they did. Who could imagine such a monstrous truth? Who could look at this handsome, grieving young man and see a murderer? Only a few noticed the cracks in the facade. An old friend of mine, a woman named Clara, who had known me since college, remarked later that she had found it strange that Jasmine, in the midst of her grief, had found the time to have her hair and makeup professionally done for the television news interview she gave that evening. In The Family Lawyer, a sharp old-school attorney named Ben Carter, who had handled our affairs for 30 years, found it odd that his first call from Jasmine less than 12 hours after the accident was not about funeral arrangements, but about the will. "Ben, darling." She had cooed into the phone, her voice thick with a manufactured sadness. "I know it's terribly soon, but Michael is just shattered, completely unable to function. I feel like I need to be the strong one, to handle the practicalities. I was just wondering when would be the appropriate time to begin the process of executing my parents-in-law's will. There are business matters, contracts that need to be seen to." Ben Carter, a man who had seen every form of human greed and depravity, had felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had politely told her that nothing could be done until the bodies were recovered and the death certificates were issued. But after he hung up the phone, he had made a call of his own, to a private investigator he kept on retainer for just such occasions. He didn't have any evidence, just a bad feeling, an old lawyer's instinct that the grief in the five-star hotel suite was as hollow as a drum. Meanwhile, Michael's performance continued. He was trapped in the lie now, a prisoner in the theater of his own making. But at night, alone in the hotel room after the sympathizers had gone home, the facade would crumble. Jasmine would be on the phone, coolly managing the logistics of their new inherited life, while Michael would be in the bathroom, retching, his body trying to expel the poison of his own guilt. He had gotten what he wanted. He had removed the obstacles to his inheritance. He was about to be a very rich man, but he was also beginning to understand the terrible, irrevocable truth. He had sold his soul, and the price was a lifetime of being haunted by the memory of his mother's face, smiling at him, just before he pushed her into the abyss. After what felt like an eternity of pain and struggle, we reached the tree line. The world of sheer rock faces and precarious ledges gave way to the blessed solid ground of the forest floor. We collapsed onto the soft, damp earth, our bodies screaming with a chorus of injuries, our lungs burning with the effort. We were still miles from civilization, still critically injured, but we had made it off the cliff face. We were alive. We lay there for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, the gentle rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the blessed, miraculous gurgle of running water. "Water," I rasped, my throat so dry the word was a barely audible crackle. Samuel, driven by that same relentless, primal instinct, pushed himself to his feet, a groan of agony escaping his lips. He stumbled through the trees, following the sound, and returned a few minutes later, his cupped hand full of the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Clear, cold, life-giving water. He brought it to my lips and I drank, the water a shocking, delicious balm to my parched throat. He made several trips, bringing me water until my thirst was finally quenched. His own needs secondary to mine. It was a simple act, but in our shattered world, it felt like a profound gesture of penance. "We need to find shelter," he said, his voice stronger now. "The temperature will drop again tonight. We won't survive another night in the open." He scanned the dense woods around us, his builder's eye looking for more than just trees. He was looking for signs of human passage, for anything that might lead us to help. And then he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible trail, barely more than a deer path, but it was a sign. Our journey resumed, but it was different now. The terrain was flatter, but the obstacles were new. Thick underbrush, fallen logs, and the ever-present, agonizing protest of our own broken bodies. Samuel went first, clearing a path with his one good arm, his movements slow but deliberate. I followed, dragging my splinted leg, using a thick branch he had found me as a crude crutch. We moved for what felt like hours, our progress painfully slow. The sun began to set again, its long golden rays slanting through the trees, creating a cathedral of light and shadow. And then, just as my last reserves of strength were about to give out, Samuel stopped. "Lena," he whispered, his voice filled with a stunned disbelief. "Look." I dragged myself forward, and looked past him. There, nestled in a small clearing by a gurgling, fast-moving river, was a small, dilapidated cabin. It was old, the wood gray and weathered, the roof sagging, but it was a structure, it was shelter, it was a miracle. We practically crawled the last 100 yards. The cabin door was unlocked, hanging crookedly on a single rusty hinge. We stumbled inside into a single dusty room. It was primitive, clearly an old fishing or hunting cabin that had been abandoned for years, but it had 4 walls and a roof. There was a stone fireplace, a rickety table, and 2 dusty cots. To us, it was a palace. Samuel managed to get a small smoky fire going in the fireplace. The warmth a blessed relief to our chilled bodies. As the firelight flickered and danced, illuminating the small dusty space, we found another miracle. In a rusty metal footlocker we found a treasure trove. A small well-stocked first aid kit, a few cans of beans and old crackers, and several wool blankets, musty and moth-eaten but blessedly warm. As I cleaned and bandaged our wounds with the supplies from the kit, a strange, almost surreal sense of domesticity settled over us. The physical struggle for survival was momentarily paused, and in that respite, the emotional wreckage we had been holding at bay came rushing back in. We sat by the fire, wrapped in the musty blankets, the silence between us as vast and as cold as the mountain night outside. We were safe, for now, but we were not the same 2 people who had sat together by a fire in our luxury cabin just 2 mornings ago. That life, that marriage was gone forever, as lost to us as if it had tumbled over the cliff's edge along with our bodies. The physical intimacy of the struggle was gone, replaced by a profound, unbridgeable emotional chasm. I looked at the man beside me, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, and I saw a stranger to whom I owed my life, and who had taken my life from me all in the same breath. The sanctuary of the cabin had saved our bodies, but it had also become a cage, forcing us to finally confront the truth of what we had become, 2 survivors forever bound by a shared trauma and irrevocably broken by a lie. We spent 2 days in the fishing cabin, a strange, suspended period of healing and quiet torment. Our bodies slowly, painfully, began to mend. The canned beans and crackers tasted like a feast. The warmth of the fire was a constant, blessed comfort. But the emotional chasm between us remained, a silent, gaping wound that no amount of bandages or antiseptic could fix. We moved around each other with the careful, distant politeness of strangers forced to share a small space. I would tend to his broken arm, cleaning the wound and changing the dressing. My touch clinical and impersonal, he would bring me water from the river or another blanket for my shivering body, his gestures full of a desperate, unspoken plea for a forgiveness I was not ready, and might never be ready to give. On the 3rd morning Samuel made a discovery. Tucked away in a dusty corner, half hidden behind a stack of old firewood, was an old rotary-style telephone. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, its cord frayed and brittle. It was clearly ancient, likely disconnected for decades. But Samuel, the builder, the man who understood systems, saw a possibility. "It's a landline," he said, his voice hoarse but tinged with a flicker of something I hadn't heard in days. Hope. The line might still be physically connected to the main trunk, even if the service is dead. Sometimes the old emergency power systems can keep a faint current running. He spent the next hour working with a methodical, focused intensity. He used a rusty fishing knife from the footlocker to carefully strip back the frayed wires, his one good hand moving with a surgeon's precision. He reconnected the bare wires to the terminals inside the old phone's casing. It was a long shot, a desperate, almost foolish hope. He picked up the heavy black receiver and placed it to his ear. He held it there for a long silent moment. I watched him, my breath caught in my throat, and then I saw it. A subtle, almost imperceptible change in his expression, a flicker of stunned disbelief. "Lena," he whispered, his eyes wide. "I have a dial tone." The words sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated adrenaline through me. A dial tone, a connection to the outside world. A way out. My first immediate thought was of rescue. 911, the sheriff. The park rangers. "Call them, Samuel," I said, my voice urgent, scrambling to sit up despite the searing pain in my leg. "Call 911 right now." But he didn't move. He just stood there holding the receiver, his face a mask of conflict. He looked at me, his eyes full of a new hard resolve I hadn't seen before. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not 911, not yet." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my relief quickly turning to a confused anger. "We're critically injured. We need a helicopter. We need a hospital." "I know," he said, his gaze steady. "But think, Lena, what happens if we call 911? They'll rescue us. We'll tell them what happened. Michael and Jasmine will be arrested. There will be a trial. Our family name, the business we spent our lives building, it will all be dragged through the mud. It will become a circus, a tawdry true crime story for the whole world to see. And Michael, no matter what he is, Lena, he is still my son. I can't I can't just hand him over to be torn apart like that. I stared at him, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest. Even now? After everything, his first instinct was to protect the boy who had tried to kill us. His son. There's another way, he said, his voice low and intense. A way to get justice? Our own justice. A way to protect the legacy, to control the narrative. But I need to make a different call first. He began to dial, the slow, rhythmic turning of the rotary dial, an anachronistic sound in our desperate situation. He wasn't calling our lawyer. He wasn't calling a friend. He was reaching back into a past I knew little about, a time before me, before the business, to a name I had only ever heard him mention once or twice, in hushed, reluctant tones. I need to speak to Elias, he said into the receiver, his voice now a low, authoritative command that was a world away from the broken man I had seen on the mountain. Tell him it's Samuel Washington. Tell him I'm calling in the marker. Yes, I'll wait. He stood there, the phone pressed to his ear, his back to me. And in that moment I realized I was not the only one in our marriage who had been keeping secrets. The quiet, predictable man I had built my life with had a hidden room in his past, a door I had never known existed, and he was about to open it. It took 3 days. 3 days of waiting in the surreal limbo of the fishing cabin, our only contact with the outside world, a series of brief, cryptic calls Samuel made on the resurrected telephone. He spoke in a kind of code, a language of veiled references and unspoken understandings, to the man named Elias. I learned, through the snippets of conversation I overheard, that Elias was not a lawyer or a cop. He was a private investigator based in Charlotte, a man Samuel had known from a rougher earlier chapter of his life, a man who specialized in problems that couldn't be solved by official channels. On the third day, a quiet, capable-looking man in hiking gear appeared at the cabin door. He was not a paramedic or a park ranger. He was one of Elias's men. He brought with him medical supplies, food, and a satellite phone. He expertly tended to our injuries, his touch as professional as any doctor's, and then he laid out the plan Samuel and Elias had orchestrated. The official story, he explained, would be that a lone hiker had found us barely alive, and had led a private rescue team to our location. We were being taken not to a public hospital in Asheville, but to a discreet private clinic in Charlotte, a place where our privacy could be absolutely guaranteed. The public narrative for now would be one of a tragic accident, with no survivors. The journey out of the mountains was a blur. A team of Elias's men, all quiet and ruthlessly efficient, carried us out on stretchers through the dense woods to a hidden access road, where a black unmarked van was waiting. As we were being loaded into the vehicle, I looked back at the vast, indifferent peaks of the Blue Ridge. I had arrived as a happy wife and mother. I was leaving as something else entirely, something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose. While we were being secretly transported to Charlotte, the next phase of the plan was already in motion. Our family lawyer, Ben Carter, who had been discreetly brought into the loop by Elias, made the call to Michael and Jasmine. He found them in their hotel suite, still performing their roles as the grief-stricken children. He told them the news they had been waiting to hear, his voice a perfect instrument of somber professional regret. Michael, Jasmine, he said, I'm so sorry to have to tell you this. The sheriff's department has called off the official search. They've located your parents' bodies. The recovery was difficult. I'm afraid they didn't survive the fall. He let that sink in, listening to their well-rehearsed gasps of grief. I know this is a terrible time, Ben continued, his voice heavy with false sympathy, but there are some practical matters we must attend to before the will can be officially executed. Your parents had some personal effects with them on the trail. Watches, wallets. My understanding is your mother was wearing a particular family heirloom, a necklace. The authorities have recovered these items, but for legal reasons, a formal identification is required from the next of kin. A formality but a necessary one. Of course, Jasmine said, her voice trembling with a convincing counterfeit sorrow. Whatever is needed. Good, Ben said. For privacy reasons, and out of respect for the family, we're not doing this at the county morgue. We've arranged to have the items brought to a secure private location, the first construction site your father ever developed, out on the old river road. It feels appropriate, a place of beginnings. Can you be there tomorrow at noon? We'll be there, Michael whispered, his voice choked with what the world would assume was grief. But what Ben Carter knew was the sound of a greedy child about to claim his prize. The trap was set. The location was not chosen for sentimental reasons. It was chosen for its isolation. The old construction site was a ghost of a place, a half-finished building on a deserted road, a place where no one would hear them scream. They thought they were going to claim their inheritance. In reality, they were walking into their judgment. The old construction site was a skeleton, the bare wooden frame of a house that had been abandoned to the elements years ago. It stood in a clearing of overgrown weeds, a monument to a forgotten dream. This had been Samuel's first solo project, a house he had poured his own sweat and blood into before a zoning dispute had bankrupted the client and halted the work forever. He had always kept the property, a quiet, painful reminder of his first failure. Now it was to be the stage for his final terrible victory. Elias's men had brought us here from the clinic. We were clean, bandaged, and sitting in two simple wooden chairs in the center of the building's main, unfinished room. The open framing of the walls allowed the noon sun to stream in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had a sturdy cane resting against my chair, my leg in a proper medical brace. Samuel's arm was in a sling. We were wounded, but we were alive, and we were waiting. Elias and one of his men stood silently in the shadows of a far corner, their presence a silent, menacing promise. We heard the crunch of tires on the gravel outside. A car door slammed, then another, footsteps approached, and then they appeared in the open doorway. Silhouetted against the bright, midday sun, Michael and Jasmine. They were dressed in somber, expensive black, the perfect attire for grieving heirs. They stepped inside, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. And then they saw us. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. Jasmine froze, her face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her flawless makeup looking like a grotesque parody on a wax doll. Michael's reaction was far more visceral. A strangled, guttural sound escaped his throat. A noise of pure animal terror. His legs gave out and he collapsed to the dusty floor, scrambling backward like a crab, his eyes wide with the horror of seeing two ghosts who had clawed their way back from the grave. "No?" he whispered, shaking his head, his well-rehearsed grief replaced by the raw, gibbering fear of a man facing his own damnation. "No? You're dead. We saw you fall. Evidently you are not as thorough as you thought," Samuel said, his voice a low, cold rumble that echoed in the cavernous, unfinished space. He did not get up. He did not need to. His power was absolute. Jasmine recovered first. The sociopath's instinct for self-preservation is a powerful thing. Her shock was instantly replaced by a frantic, desperate attempt to spin a new lie. "Oh my God," she cried, rushing forward, her face a mask of manufactured relief and joy.
"You're alive."
"We've been so worried. We went for help. We called 911. We told them where you were. We've been waiting by the phone every single second." Her performance was magnificent. It was flawless. But she was playing to an audience that had already read the script. "That's a lie," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through her theatrical sobs. It was the first time I had spoken. My voice was different, stripped of all its warmth, all its motherly softness. It was the voice of a judge. She stopped, her fake tears drying instantly. She looked at me and in my cold, dead eyes, she saw that the game was over. "We have the 911 call logs, Jasmine," Samuel said, his voice flat. "We know you waited over an hour to call. We have the testimony of the hikers you passed on the trail on your way down, who said you seemed calm, not panicked. We have the preliminary report from Ben's investigator, detailing your immediate inquiries into the will." He paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle. "But more than that," he said, his gaze shifting to the pathetic, whimpering figure of his son on the floor. "We have the truth, and now Michael is going to tell it to us." He looked at Michael, and his voice softened almost imperceptibly, the last dying echo of a father's love. "Get up, boy," he said. "Get up and tell your mother why you did it. Tell her the truth. It's the only thing left that can save you now." Michael, broken and sobbing, dragged himself to his feet. He couldn't look at me. He looked only at Samuel, his face a mess of tears and snot and guilt. "I'm sorry," he wept. "Dad, I'm so sorry. The debts, the gambling." Jasmine said it was the only way. She said you would never give me control, that you didn't respect me. She planned it all. I didn't want to, but I was weak. "I'm so sorry." I listened to his pathetic, sniveling confession, and I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, just a vast, cold emptiness. He was a stranger to me. A weak, foolish man who had tried to kill me for money. Then Jasmine, seeing that she was cornered, that her puppet had cut his own strings, showed her true colors, her face twisted into a snarl of pure venomous hatred. "You weak, pathetic fool," she screamed at Michael. "You were supposed to be strong. We were supposed to be free." She then turned her fury on me. "This is your fault, you old bitch. Holding onto your money, your control. You forced our hand. We deserved that life." And there it was. The ugly, unvarnished truth of her soul. Elias stepped out of the shadows. "I believe we've heard enough," he said, his voice calm and final. He and his man moved towards them, and for the first time Michael and Jasmine realized they were not alone. The trap had closed. The sterile white-walled room of the rehabilitation facility smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. It had been my home for the past 3 weeks, a place of painful physical therapy and even more painful contemplation. My broken leg was healing, the bones slowly knitting themselves back together, but the other fractures, the ones in my heart and in my soul, were not so easily mended. The legal fallout had been swift and brutal. Faced with no way out, Jasmine had turned on Michael with the ferocity of a cornered snake, trying to paint him as the mastermind. Michael, in turn, had given a full pathetic confession, detailing her manipulation and his own weakness. Their mutual destruction was total. Elias, with his discreet and powerful influence, had ensured that the official narrative was one of business fraud and conspiracy, keeping the ugliest, most personal details of the attempted murder out of the press. Jasmine and Michael were both facing long, inevitable prison sentences. The Washington family name, though bruised, would survive. The business was secure, now under the temporary steady hand of a management team Samuel had appointed. Samuel sat in a chair opposite me, his own arm now out of its sling, a long angry scar on his forehead, the only visible reminder of the fall. He had been here every day, a silent, constant presence. He brought me books I didn't read, flowers whose fragrance I couldn't appreciate. He talked quietly about the business, about the weather, about anything and everything except the one thing that lay between us, the vast, uncrossable canyon of his 33-year-old lie. Today the silence was different. It was not the silence of avoidance. It was the heavy, expectant silence that comes before a final verdict. He had given me the full, unvarnished truth of his affair, of Michael's birth, of his decades of deceit. He had answered every one of my cold, clinical questions. He had laid his soul bare before me, and now he was waiting for his sentence. "Our life was a lie, Samuel," I said, my voice quiet but strong, the first words I had spoken to him all morning. I looked at him, truly looked at him, not as my husband but as the man he was, a flawed, frightened human being, who had made a catastrophic mistake and had spent a lifetime trying to outrun its consequences. "I know," he whispered, his eyes filled with a pain that was almost too much to bear. "And I will spend the rest of my life, however long you will let me, trying to make up for it." "Make up for it?" I said, a humorless laugh escaping my lips. "How do you make up for a lie that has defined a woman's entire life? How do you make up for the ghost of a child I never had, and the ghost of the son I thought I did? You can't, Samuel. Some things can't be fixed. They can only be survived." I turned my gaze from him and looked out the window. From my room I had a clear view of the distant, hazy peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. They looked beautiful and serene from here, their treacherous, deadly nature hidden by the distance. "But our survival," I continued, my voice a soft, musing whisper, "that was real. I thought of the long, agonizing crawl down the mountain, of his hand giving me water, of his desperate, primal need to keep me alive. In that crucible, stripped of all our lies and illusions, a different kind of bond had been forged between us, a grim partnership born of shared trauma. He had betrayed me as a husband, but he had fought for me as a fellow survivor. Was it enough? Could a new life be built on the scorched earth of the old one? Could a new trust be grown in the ruins of such a complete deception? I didn't know. The love I had felt for him, the easy, comfortable love of a lifetime together, was gone. It had died on that mountain ledge, but in its place was something else. Something raw, complicated, and perhaps in its own way unbreakable. "I have inherited a life I never chose, Samuel," I said, my eyes still fixed on the mountains. "A life without a son, a life with a husband I am not sure I know. My inheritance is a world of questions." He said nothing. He simply waited. He knew the final, most important question was the one I was asking myself. I had survived the fall, but now I faced a new, steeper and far more treacherous mountain. The climb to decide if the man sitting across from me, the stranger who had both saved my life and destroyed it, was a husband I could learn to forgive, or a ghost I had to leave behind. The path forward was shrouded in fog, and for the first time in my life I had no map. I was utterly, terrifyingly, and perhaps finally free.